The cowboy was already riding after her when the truth about the old fire finally came to light. But what she did next left the entire valley holding its breath. Smoke rolled across the ranch yard as horses kicked against the corral rails. Abigail's fingers trembled around a bundle of faded letters, while Sheriff Owen read a name aloud. Nearby, Wyatt stood motionless, ash on his coat and a fresh tear in his sleeve from the night's chaos. Then Abigail turned toward the road leading out of town and took a step no one expected. What she had just discovered would force a choice she could no longer avoid. If you're enjoying the story, tell us where you're watching from and come along for the journey. Winter arrived early in Red Creek, Montana in 1886. By late afternoon, snow drifted across the railroad platform in thin white ribbons. The wind carried the smell of coal smoke from the tracks and pushed loose paper against the wooden posts of the station. Abigail Reed sat alone on a bench near the end of the platform. A worn brown suitcase rested beside her boots. Everything she owned was inside: a folded dress, a Bible with a cracked cover, a small tin box holding school records she had never been able to throw away, and a photograph she no longer looked at. The station master had already locked half the building. The last train of the day was gone. The boarding house on Main Street had turned her away that morning. The second one had done the same before lunch. The woman at the laundry had listened to her request for work, then suddenly remembered she wasn't hiring. People rarely said why. They didn't have to. The story always arrived before Abigail did. A schoolhouse fire, a dead child, a teacher who survived. Facts traveled slowly in the West. Rumors traveled much faster. Abigail pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Her gloves were worn thin at the fingertips. The cold found its way through them anyway. Across the street, lamps flickered to life inside the diner. Families hurried through the snow. A ranch hand laughed at something his friend said. Someone led a mule toward the stable. Life continued. It simply continued without her. She lowered her eyes to the suitcase. For a moment, she wondered if Colorado had been a mistake. Maybe leaving had changed nothing. Maybe there was no place far enough away. A sharp gust swept across the station. Snow danced over the platform. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, slow, steady, unhurried. Abigail looked up. A rider approached from the north road. The horse was large and dark, its breath rising in white clouds. The man in the saddle wore a heavy wool coat dusted with snow. He slowed near the platform, then stopped. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The man glanced at the suitcase, then at her face. His eyes were gray, calm, and strangely direct. Not curious, not suspicious, just observant, as though he were looking at exactly what stood before him and nothing else. Abigail was the first to look away. She had grown used to people recognizing her. Waiting for the judgment, waiting for the questions. They never took long. Instead, the stranger removed his gloves. "You're not waiting for a train," he said. It wasn't really a question. "No." The wind moved between them. "You got family in town?" "No," he nodded once, again silence. Then he looked toward the darkening sky. Snow was falling harder now, the kind that covered roads before morning. "My name's Wyatt Turner." Abigail had heard that name. Everyone in Red Creek had. The rancher from Elk Valley, the widower who kept mostly to himself. The man people respected even when they didn't understand him. She hesitated. "Abigail Reed." Something flickered in his expression. Not recognition, not judgment, just acknowledgement. He seemed to consider something. Then he stepped down from the saddle. The horse stood quietly beside him. Wyatt picked up her suitcase before she could protest. Abigail stared at him. "You don't even know me." He looked at the suitcase in his hand, then back at her. The station bell rang somewhere behind them. The daylight was fading fast. Finally, he said 4 words that would change both their lives. "Come home with me." Abigail stood motionless as snow settled on her coat. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't know what came next. And somehow that frightened her less than staying where she was. The ride out of Red Creek happened mostly in silence. Snow fell steadily around them. The road curved north through cottonwoods and frozen creek beds before climbing into rolling foothills. Wyatt rode ahead, leading a second horse that Abigail mounted after they left town. Neither seemed eager to fill the cold air with unnecessary words. The only sounds were hooves pressing into fresh snow and the occasional creak of leather. Darkness had settled by the time they reached Elk Valley. Abigail saw lanterns glowing through the trees first, then fences, a long barn, several outbuildings, and beyond them a ranch house sitting against the white landscape, with smoke rising from its chimney. It looked lived in, not grand, not poor, just steady. The kind of place built by people who expected winter and planned for it. Wyatt dismounted and carried her suitcase onto the porch. Inside, warmth met her immediately. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner. Coffee simmered on its top. The room smelled faintly of pine wood and fresh bread. A boy appeared in the doorway. 12 years old, dark hair, sharp eyes. He stopped when he saw Abigail. "Who's that?" he asked. Wyatt removed his gloves. "This is Abigail Reed." The boy studied her, then looked at Wyatt. "Is she staying?" "For a while." The boy nodded as though accepting weather. "I'm Caleb." Abigail offered a small smile. "Nice to meet you." He disappeared toward the kitchen without another word. That earned the slightest change in Wyatt's expression. Not quite amusement. Close. The room prepared for Abigail was small but clean. A quilt covered the bed. A wash basin sat on a wooden stand. Someone had left a fresh candle beside it. Abigail stood alone after Wyatt closed the door. For several moments she simply looked around. No train station, no boarding house, no waiting room, no one asking questions. Outside, wind brushed softly against the walls. Inside, everything was still. The next morning began before sunrise. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and the distant sounds of ranch life. Boots crossing the yard, a gate opening, the low call of cattle. By the time she entered the kitchen, Wyatt was already dressed for work. Caleb sat at the table fighting with a spelling book. The boy frowned at the page. Abigail glanced down. "You skipped 3 words." Caleb blinked. "How'd you know?" "You skipped the same 3 yesterday." The boy stared, then slowly slid the book toward her. Wyatt watched the exchange over the rim of his coffee cup. He said nothing, but she noticed. Over the following days, life settled into a rhythm. Abigail helped organize supply invoices stacked in a cabinet near the office. Some were months out of order. Others were missing entries entirely. She rebuilt the books one evening while snow tapped softly against the windows. The next morning, Wyatt stood looking over the ledger. "You did all this?" There were errors. He turned several pages. "You found them pretty quick." Abigail shrugged. They weren't hiding very hard. Again that almost smile appeared, then vanished. Words spread through the ranch slowly. The hands remained polite, but distant. Most weren't rude. They simply watched, measured, waited. Abigail understood that. People often did. One afternoon she walked the northern pasture checking inventory notes Wyatt had given her. The sky was clear. The snow reflected sunlight so brightly it hurt her eyes. That was when she saw it. A section of fence had been cut. Not broken, cut, fresh. Beyond it, dozens of cattle were drifting dangerously close to a narrow ravine hidden beneath snow. Abigail dropped the ledger, immediately began shouting and waving her coat. The nearest ranch hands heard her. Within minutes, men were racing across the pasture. Horses thundered through the snow. Ropes flew. The herd slowly turned. One animal slipped near the edge before recovering. Another few minutes and hundreds of cattle could have been lost. By sunset, the crisis had passed. The damaged fence stood repaired. The cattle were safe. Wyatt knelt beside the original post, examining the cut wood. His gloved fingers traced the mark. Then he stood. His face had grown very still. "That wasn't weather," he said. "No, someone had done it on purpose." The wind moved across the valley. The mountains stood silent beyond the ranch. For the first time since arriving, Abigail felt something shift beneath the surface of this quiet place. Someone was watching. Someone had been here. And whoever it was had not come by accident. The repaired fence held through the night. But the feeling stayed with Abigail long after the ranch hands returned to their cabins. At breakfast the next morning, Wyatt spread a folded map across the kitchen table. Caleb ate oatmeal while pretending not to listen. Wyatt marked the northern pasture with the tip of a pencil. No tracks? Abigail shook her head. The snow covered most of them before sunrise. He nodded once. Neither said what both were thinking. Whoever had cut that fence knew the ranch, knew where the cattle grazed, and knew exactly how much damage could have been done. The days moved on, but something had changed. Winter settled deeper into Elk Valley. Frost covered the barn roof every morning. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight gray lines. The ranch remained busy. Yet Abigail often noticed Wyatt scanning distant hills while repairing tack or checking livestock. Watching, waiting. One Saturday she rode into Red Creek with him for supplies. The wagon rattled along the frozen road beneath the pale winter sky. Caleb sat beside her bundled in a thick wool coat, talking about a book she had started reading with him. His excitement faded the moment they entered town. People noticed her. Some only glanced, others stared. A conversation outside the barber shop ended abruptly when she passed. At the general store, Martha Quinn greeted her with the same warm voice she used for everyone else. That alone felt unusual. "Morning, Abigail." "Morning, Martha." The older woman handed her a sack of coffee beans. Fresh shipment came in yesterday. It was a small kindness, a normal kindness, the sort people rarely understand the value of until they've gone without it. Abigail thanked her. Outside, she caught fragments of whispers drifting across the boardwalk. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Everyone knew who they were about. By the time they returned to the wagon, the familiar heaviness had settled across her shoulders. Wyatt loaded supplies into the back without speaking. Then he handed her a paper-wrapped cinnamon biscuit from the bakery. She looked at it. Then at him. "I didn't order this." "No." A pause. "You skipped breakfast," that was all he said. The wagon rolled home beneath gathering clouds. Abigail stared out across the snow-covered valley and held the warm biscuit in both hands. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty, comfortable, dangerously comfortable. Weeks passed. Christmas came and went quietly. Caleb hung handmade decorations across the porch. Abigail helped him string dried berries and pine branches along the railings. One afternoon, Wyatt found them laughing after a failed attempt to build a snowman that looked more like a fallen sack of potatoes. He stood watching from the barn doorway. Neither Abigail nor Caleb noticed at first. When they finally did, Wyatt looked away almost immediately and returned to his work. But the corner of his mouth betrayed him. For a moment. Just a moment. Abigail carried that image longer than she meant to. Then the rumors reached a new level. At church, at the diner, at the feed store, everywhere. Hank Mercer made certain of it. The banker never spoke directly. Men like Hank rarely did. Instead, he planted ideas, questions, suggestions. Soon, people repeated them as though they were their own. By January, half the town seemed convinced Abigail brought trouble wherever she went. One evening, Caleb came home unusually quiet. He sat at the supper table staring into his stew. Abigail noticed first. "What happened?" The boy shrugged. "Nothing." But children were poor liars. Eventually, the truth came out. A boy in town had repeated the story about the school fire. Said Abigail belonged somewhere else. Said she shouldn't be living with the Turners. The room fell silent. Caleb pushed his bowl away. "He's wrong." Abigail looked down at her hands. Before she could answer, Wyatt spoke. His voice remained calm. "He is. Simple, certain, no hesitation." Caleb nodded. The conversation ended there. Yet, Abigail remembered it long after everyone had gone to bed. Because Wyatt had never once asked whether the rumors were true. Not once. February brought the town meeting. The church hall filled before sunset. Ranchers, shopkeepers, families. Everyone seemed to have found a reason to attend. Abigail stood near the back, Wyatt beside her. Hank Mercer eventually rose from his seat. His black coat looked expensive even in lantern light. His voice carried easily through the room. He spoke about reputation, community, responsibility. Then he finally arrived at the point everyone had been expecting. A man in Mr. Turner's position should consider what kind of example he's setting. The room grew still, no names, no accusations. Yet everyone understood, Hank continued. A person with Abigail Reed's history may not be the influence this town needs. Several people nodded, others stared at the floor. Abigail felt every eye in the room without looking up. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Wyatt stood. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head turned. His expression revealed nothing. His voice remained steady. She stays, that was it. 2 words, no speech, no defense, no explanation, just certainty. The silence that followed felt enormous. Hank blinked. Several people exchanged uneasy looks, and Abigail stood completely still. Because for the first time in years, someone had chosen her side before knowing whether it would cost him anything. Outside, snow began falling again, soft, quiet. But somewhere beyond the church windows, another storm was already gathering, and Hank Mercer was far from finished. The winter held on longer than usual that year. March arrived, but snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the pines. The roads between Red Creek and Elk Valley turned to mud during the day and froze hard again each night. Life at the ranch continued. Cattle needed feeding, fences needed mending. Caleb still struggled with long division. Abigail still corrected him with the patience of someone who had spent years teaching children. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something had changed. People in town had begun choosing sides. Some remained loyal to Hank Mercer. Others quietly wondered why the banker seemed so determined to drive one woman away. The questions reached Sheriff Owen Brooks. At first, he ignored them. Then an old man walked into his office carrying a weathered cigar box. The visitor was Elias Harper, 72 years old, former maintenance worker at the Colorado school where the fire had happened years earlier. His hands shook as he placed the box on Owen's desk. "I should have come sooner," he said. Inside were receipts, repair requests, letters. Most were faded. One caught Owen's attention immediately. A request for furnace repairs dated 6 months before the fire. The request had never been approved. At the bottom sat a signature, Hank Mercer. The sheriff read the page twice, then a third time. 3 days later, he rode to Elk Valley. Abigail was helping Caleb sort books when Owen arrived. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face. The sheriff removed his hat. "I think we need to talk." The room became very quiet. An hour later, Abigail sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old documents. Her fingers rested on the edge of the paper. She didn't touch the signature. She didn't need to. She remembered that furnace. Remembered the strange smell some mornings. Remembered filing complaints. Remembered being told not to worry. Wyatt sat beside her, not speaking, just present. Owen finally looked up. "We may need to go back. Colorado." The word seemed to settle over the room like fresh snow. Abigail hadn't spoken its name in years. Neither had she planned to return. Yet a week later, she found herself riding south beside Wyatt. The journey took several days. Mountains gave way to open country. Then smaller settlements. Then roads she had once known by heart. The school sat abandoned at the edge of a field. Its windows were broken. Its paint had long since peeled away. Grass grew where children once played. Abigail stood staring at it. The wind moved through the empty structure with a low whistle. For a moment, she was 20 years old again, standing in the same place, watching smoke rise into the sky. Wyatt stepped beside her. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't offer comforting words. He simply remained there, and somehow that helped more. Inside the building, they found records hidden beneath loose floorboards in the former office. Old ledgers, property transfers, maintenance logs. Most important of all, a series of letters. One letter mentioned the faulty furnace. Another warned of possible danger. Both had been sent directly to Hank Mercer. Neither had received a response. Abigail lowered the final page. The room felt suddenly smaller. All those years, all that blame, all that silence, someone had known and done nothing. The truth traveled back to Montana with them. But so did the danger. Because once Hank learned what they had found, he stopped pretending. 3 nights after their return, Abigail woke to shouting outside. She sat upright. The bedroom window glowed orange. Not lantern light, fire. She ran outside. Men were already racing across the yard. The hay barn burned against the darkness. Flames climbed high into the night sky. Horses screamed from inside nearby corrals. Someone shouted Wyatt's name. Abigail's heart nearly stopped. She spotted him through the smoke, moving toward frightened animals trapped behind a gate. The ranch hands worked together. Buckets, ropes, shouting. Snowmelt and mud covered the ground. What felt like hours was only minutes. Eventually, the horses were freed. The fire was contained before it spread farther. When dawn arrived, the barn stood blackened and ruined. Steam rose from wet timbers. Abigail found Wyatt sitting on an overturned bucket near the corral. His coat smelled faintly of smoke. A small cut marked one cheek, nothing serious. Still, she stopped walking for a second after seeing it. Wyatt noticed. "I'm fine." The words were simple, yet she released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Across the yard, Sheriff Owen examined boot prints near the rear fence. His expression darkened. The sheriff already suspected what Abigail feared. The fire hadn't been an accident. Someone was trying very hard to keep the past buried, and now the truth was closer than it had ever been. Spring arrived slowly in Montana. The snow retreated from the lower hills first. Then, the creek behind the ranch began running again, carrying bits of ice downstream beneath the cottonwoods. The burned remains of the hay barn still stood at the edge of the property. Every morning, Abigail saw it from the kitchen window. Every morning, Wyatt and the ranch hands worked a little longer rebuilding what had been lost. Life moved forward, even when people weren't ready for it. 3 weeks after the fire, Sheriff Owen Brooks called a town meeting. The church was full before noon. Farmers arrived in muddy boots. Merchants closed their stores early. Families crowded the back rows. The entire town seemed to know something important was coming. Abigail sat near the side wall beside Martha Quinn. Wyatt stood near the rear entrance. Neither spoke much. The room already felt heavy enough. Sheriff Brooks stepped forward carrying a stack of documents. The old maintenance records, the furnace reports, the letters recovered from Colorado. One by one, he laid them across the table. Then Elias Harper stood and told his story. The old man's voice trembled, but it never broke. He described the warnings, the requests for repairs, the letters sent to Hank Mercer, the signatures, the ignored notices. The room grew quieter with every sentence. When Owen finally held up the last document, nobody looked toward Abigail. Every eye had turned toward Hank Mercer. The banker sat rigid in his chair, his face pale. For years he had been the man people trusted, the man who financed businesses, the man who shook hands after church. Now people stared at him as though seeing someone else entirely. Hank tried to explain, then defend himself, then deny it. But the documents remained where they were. Paper does not forget. By the end of the afternoon, 2 deputies escorted him from the church. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The silence said enough. Outside, sunlight spilled across Main Street. Abigail stood on the boardwalk, watching the crowd slowly disperse. People nodded as they passed. A few stopped. One woman apologized. Another lowered her eyes. A rancher removed his hat. Abigail accepted each gesture politely. But she found she no longer needed them. Something had changed during those months. The town's opinion no longer carried the same weight, because her life had stopped depending on it. Back at Elk Valley, the rebuilding continued. New lumber arrived. Fresh hay was stacked. Caleb spent afternoons helping where he could, usually creating twice as much work as he solved. The ranch felt alive again. Yet Abigail found herself growing quieter. One evening, she sat alone on the porch after supper. The mountains glowed gold beneath the setting sun. A meadowlark sang somewhere near the creek. She held a folded letter in her hands, a teaching position. A small settlement west of Helena needed a school teacher. It was respectable work, the sort of work she had once dreamed of returning to. She stared at the letter for a long time, then folded it again. 2 mornings later, she packed her suitcase. The same suitcase she had carried into Red Creek months earlier. the same one Wyatt had lifted from the train platform. Caleb found her first. His eyes widened. "You're leaving?" Abigail forced a smile. "Just for a new beginning." The boy looked unconvinced. By afternoon, the wagon was ready. The road stretched toward the valley entrance. Abigail climbed aboard. She didn't look back immediately. If she did, she wasn't sure she would leave. The horses started forward. The ranch slowly disappeared behind her. Then came the sound of hoofbeats. Fast, closing the distance. She knew the horse before she turned around. Wyatt reined in beside the wagon. Dust drifted around them. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the grass. Then Wyatt reached into his coat pocket. He held out a small brass key. Abigail looked at it, then at him. "The cabin near the south meadow," he said. Her breath caught. The little cabin overlooked the creek. She had always loved it. "I asked you to come home with me once." His voice remained calm, steady, just like the day they met. "I never meant for you to leave." The world seemed to go very still. Abigail looked past him, back toward the ranch. Caleb stood balanced on a fence rail, watching. Several ranch hands waited nearby. No one said a word. No one needed to. For years, Abigail had been the person people left behind. The person sent away. The person blamed. The person forgotten. Standing there beneath the wide Montana sky, she realized something. Nobody was asking her to leave. For the first time in a very long while, people were waiting for her to stay. Tears blurred her vision. She laughed softly and wiped them away before they could fall. Then she took the key. Late that summer, beneath a clear blue sky beside the river, Abigail Reed married Wyatt Turner. The ceremony was small, simple. Friends, neighbors, people who mattered, nothing more, and it was enough. Months later, children filled a one-room schoolhouse at the edge of Elk Valley. Books lined the shelves. Sunlight spilled across wooden desks. Abigail stood at the front of the room, reading aloud while young voices followed along. Outside the window, Wyatt repaired a section of fence. Caleb raced across the field, chasing a runaway hat. The school bell rang. A horse whinnied somewhere beyond the pasture. Abigail glanced through the window. Wyatt looked up at the exact same moment. Their eyes met. Both smiled. The valley stretched around them, green and endless beneath the mountains. And for the first time in years, Abigail wasn't searching for a place to belong. She was already home. Maybe that's why this story stays with us, long after the last page is turned. Because most of us know what it feels like to carry something from the past. A mistake, a loss, a rumor, a wound nobody else can see. We keep walking, keep working, keep smiling when we have to, while quietly wondering if we'll ever find a place where we don't have to explain ourselves. Imagine standing where Abigail once stood on that snowy train platform. No plan, no certainty. Just one small suitcase and a world that seemed ready to move on without you. And then imagine what it would mean if one person looked past all the noise, past the gossip, past the mistakes people thought they understood, and simply said, "Come home with me." Maybe the lesson isn't that life suddenly becomes easy. It rarely does. Maybe the lesson is that healing often begins with something much smaller. A hand held out. A door left open. A person who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. And sometimes, the love that changes a life doesn't arrive with grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, day after day, until one morning you realize you're no longer carrying the weight alone. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'd truly love to know. And if stories like Abigail and Wyatt's remind you that kindness, courage, and second chances still matter, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting down the trail. Stories of hope, mystery, healing, and the people who find their way home when they least expect it.